Well, this brings me to a question. Based on my experience this very day with a person who, well, let's see, how do I describe? She is a massage therapist, also does craniosacral massage. And some time ago, I gave her my book. And she said it was miraculously timed because she had had these issues on her mind. And she's kind of lost. She's, I would say, early 40s, maybe. Her father was a Jew. Her mother was an Orthodox Christian. I asked her about a number of things about her life, and she said that she volunteered. She was 9 years sober.
12 steps.
Yeah, exactly. And she's just not, she wants to turn to religion, but doesn't really know what to do, and knows enough about Judaism and I think Christianity to think about being daunted by all of the complex rituals that she would need to learn long before coming to assimilate those forms and then be able to use them in the kind of spiritual, mystical sense that we all talk about. So I again was faced with the question, where to send her, what to do, because she's asking for advice.
Has she said much about her 12-step experience?
No, other than she's 9 years sober.
Does she still attend meetings?
That I don't know. My sense of things is that she does. Part of the conversation was about drugs, and she said she didn't really know anything about drugs because she's tried to have no one other than sober people in her life since then. So, it's an interesting problem because she's really seeking.
I mean, I would ask her about her 12-step experience and how well did it spiritually benefit her, and if so, how? And if she's looking for something more, what does she think is missing?
Well, she's been afraid, her words, afraid to make any commitments, afraid of commitments.
Well, I don't know anything about her, but if she is not offended by profanity, she might like to hear some of Paul Hederman's 12-step videos because he opens the 12 steps up. And if she likes that understanding of the 12 steps, then she can listen to his non-dual stuff.
Yes, well, this is an interesting problem, not just because I know her and I'd like to help her, but in many ways, this is sort of paradigmatic of the age and time and population that needs help.
Oh, sure.
Fortunately, she knows she needs help.
That's the first step.
I did not feel it was effective or appropriate or right to say, learn all you can about Islam, or learn all you can about Christianity, or learn all you can about Judaism.
No.
That just doesn't go anywhere. I mean, if you want to study mysticism in the Jewish tradition, you need to be male, married, 40, and have been raised with the Torah.
Yes, before you can get into the traditional Hasidic community, which has a lot of attributes of what they call in Israel ultra-Orthodox. And that's not so great. That's not really required to get into the Kabbalah or the Zohar. But she might have a hard time finding a community.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, there's really, in this day and age, there's really only three options, realistically speaking, for most people: Islam, Christianity, and Buddhism. The few other options are either lacking in something or put up too many barriers to seekers. I mean, it's not in any way to disparage the traditions of Judaism or Hinduism, but unless you have been born into one of those traditions and have a particular bent towards some of the deeper rituals, I think just what is open right now is Islam, Christianity, and Buddhism. And for most people, it depends. For someone that, let's say, is a Russian immigrant, there's obviously the familiarity with Christianity, but that can be a good thing and a bad thing. Despite the history of Greece with Turkey and all the negative stuff there, I was always able to talk to some Greek friends about Islam, but some of them were too traumatized by growing up in the families So this is the problem. A lot of times you have someone and they have trauma in their family because of the particular way the culture has perverted the religion, and so they don't necessarily want much to do with that religion. I personally have that issue. I mean, I deeply love a lot of the real Catholicism, but because of the trauma I experienced with a particular perverse form of American Catholicism, it's not something I wanted in my life, and so Islam was a more sensible option.
So there she was in need, asking, and I just thought I'd raise the question since it's one that comes to all of us.
So what advice did you give to her?
Well, I gave her the book Untethered Soul and said, let me know what you think about this, and then I'll know what to give you next.
And is she the type of person who reads a lot?
Yes.
That's good.
She is not what we think of as an intellectual.
Doesn't mean they don't read.
She reads a lot.
I would try to get a little more precision from her, if possible.
This is helpful. Yes.
And I really think the connection with 12 steps, I mean, this is something she's lived for 9 years. And it's possible that by acknowledging the spiritual nature of the 12 steps, or of the 12-step program, she would find an easier way to talk to you about such things.
Yes. Well, I sent her Paul Hederman videos.
Oh, you did? All right.
Because, as you say, it's an obvious choice.
Yeah. I mean, I have one of his 12-step videos queued up to watch because it had an interesting title, but I haven't started it. It's Action/Service Flows, just as prayer and meditation do. That's the title he put on this session. In other words, it's the verb.
Yes.
So anyway, that title caught my attention. I have it queued up, but I haven't tried to listen to it yet.
All right. Well, that's what was on my mind, which I wanted to share because I think it's a lot about what we're doing here.
Well, I'll just answer what you were asking with one of your own answers that's quite common, which it just depends on the individual. I think you can't really have a blanket view of, oh, how do we guide people? The people that I'm talking to tend to be rather intellectual and approach everything from the environmentalist, eco-conscious perspective. Other people need to come at it from a completely different perspective. So I think it's just important that you use your own intuition, because as far as I know, none of the other three of us know this person. And so any advice we could give would be really paltry in comparison to anything that you could.
Yes, I've often made the point about all guidance is individual, but I found myself catching myself against the notion of sending anybody to Judaism or Islam or Christianity at this point.
Sure.
Just because those three religions are so broad and complicated.
Can I give a piece of advice? Sheikh Issa tends to write for intellectuals, but why don't you refer this person to, let's say, something like Huxley's book on the perennial philosophy, which is largely quotes from different traditions, and then see if any of these traditions speak to her.
That's a good idea. Huxley on the perennial philosophy?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a good one. I gave that one to somebody once, and he really liked it, but he didn't seem to want to go further with it. So I thought, well, he has a book he likes.
Well, her response to my book, these are her words, is the same as her response to the book on breathing I gave her, which is, yes, this is right, this is true. What do I do?
Well, there is that.
Well, there's always the question of why is she asking these questions now? What has happened? Has anything changed in her life recently that she has begun to ask these questions?
Good question.
And trying to figure out if somehow there's a psychological or a spiritual hunger that she's wanting to satisfy, but she doesn't know where to satisfy it. So I don't want to answer this question for her, but I think that's a question one could ask is, why are you seeking? What are you looking for?
Good. That's helpful. What is she seeking? Well, I'll let you know how this one unfolds.
The question. 1. Traditional conceptions of God make it a he. Clearly that anthropomorphizes God. But if and when you picture God, how do you see the divine being?
The notion of seeing the divine being invites certain errors that are beneath his or her dignity, but are inevitable, because finally, in terms of seeing, the only thing you ever see is seeing anyway. Let's
True.
not make him an object.
But if being is a verb and not just a gerund of an adjective, or a noun rather, then to see it would be to behold an unfolding something or other. And that's what made me think of this little animated image.
Well, let's have other answers on this first.
All right, how about the anthropomorphic part?
I don't picture an anthropomorphic God.
I don't either, but I thought there may be more problems with that than there is in the term divine being.
For sure.
And it's a shame people have sort of inherited that anthropomorphic thing. When I think of God, I don't usually think about anything.
I wonder if you looked at any of the anthropomorphic representations of God, and I'm thinking of the ones from classical art. Do the artists who created those images really see God that way, or is it just clear to them that this is a symbol and how it's expressed?
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised either way, but I prefer the latter.
Advaita Vedanta, do you have any insight on that?
Well, I think it depends. I mean, I think anthropomorphizing God is very helpful for me. I don't see the God ultimately in that form, but discussing God or meditating upon God, I think thinking about attributes, whether it's the names or it's a icon or it's God depicted in one of its classical forms, is exceptionally useful. So unlike Muslims, I actually think the anthropomorphization of God as an aid to meditation is a wonderful thing, as long as you don't reify that image and think that that image encompasses God.
Right. I can imagine someone painting a picture primarily interested in expressing God's glory, for instance, and just knowing that that image was the language that would be necessary for anybody, very many people to get it.
I guess on the other hand, if you're trying to earn a living as a painter and you get a commission to do the creation of Adam, God turns into an old man with a beard.
Yeah, which is a natural image, really.
Yes, the question I asked him before is, did anybody really think that was anything other than symbols, qualities, attributes?
It's hard to imagine that. I would think that most likely an artist would see it as an expression rather than a thing, and that those that couldn't do that were just doing it for the money. They're not worth considering. They're just selling religious trinkets.
Do you have any insight on this one, Advaita Vedanta?
I think, again, it depends. I think it depends on the artist. Look to something from Botticelli, for instance. Those things lead you right to God. But, I mean, that is an image depicting divine realities. And I believe that was Botticelli's aim. I believe that that was what his particular perspective was, and it was a means to get people to God. It's not to say that those icon makers on the streets believe that. There's all sorts of debased forms of image making, which is what I think the original commandment was against, which is what I think maybe the people were doing in Mecca. But I do think that there are many artists that absolutely believe that the reality is much more profound than any image could encompass, but the image is a rope that they hope to connect, on the one hand, this mundane world, and on the other, the transcendent reality, and they hope that this rope can guide people.
Right. If the picture draws them into the picture and does its job, it draws you into the divine presence, which is really the experiential result that one would want.
All right, so to continue with your question here, how important is it that we continue the traditional form of referring to God as He?
I've tried just replacing He with the word God, and that's the simplest accommodation to our tendency now to try to be more precise.
Well, Greg, for example, always refers to God as God. Francis will generally refer to God as she.
Sure, that's fine.
In one of the better translations, from what I've heard, translations of the Bible into Chinese, it just says in the beginning was Tao, and word or God, it's Tao. And Chinese doesn't have grammatical gender like English does, but in order to not distort the English language and to sound right when you say things, sometimes you have to give God a gender. My personal preference of what I do, sometimes I refer to God as he, sometimes she, sometimes it, sometimes it's God, sometimes it's gods. And by mixing it up, I feel like that's not pinning down a God to some form that limits God, because I feel like the greatest sin is limiting God when God is beyond all of these limits.
Right.
But I've seen that very thing from Francis too.
Right. And gender is a limitation, but gender can also express the relationship that one personally feels with God.
And as long as you're talking about a relationship, it may be appropriate term. But when you shift to talk about something else, it may not be the right pronoun.
Well, yeah, sure.
Theta Zainab?
Well, I was just going to reiterate the same point that Saida Badria actually mentioned, that we all refer to God in whatever way we can relate to him or her. So growing up in a Hindu family, I used to refer to God as her.
Which particular her was that?
Durga.
Okay.
She was my role model.
And still is, I hear.
Well, yes, maybe not to that extent, because in Hinduism, the deity has an effect. The deity that you worship ultimately has an effect on how you become. So Durga symbolizes the goddess of destruction. So it can be very powerful, and I can certainly...
Do you know that in Greg's Hindu phase, that was the deity he selected?
I do know. I remember him saying it. But in my early 20s, and especially the time when I was in England, I then changed to Ganesh, which is a he. So that time I was referring to him as a he. So from my upbringing, the whole gender was never an issue, and neither did I need a gender to address God. And I think that very much depends on your own individual way of referring to things in the world, whether you choose to use he or she or God or it. But I do know from my limited knowledge of Arabic, now people who have translated Quran, they have the word huwa, which actually not only means he, it also means it.
Right.
So when I came to know that, I was like, oh, this is interesting. Although I knew just because the sacred scripture says huwa or he doesn't mean the God has gender. But I know this can be an issue for some people, but for others it may not be.
One of the greatest explications of that particular principle and the use of feminine names for God in Islam is in the Tao of Islam. I've often thought is essential reading for the Tariqa.
Absolutely.
Next question. Do you believe religions to be divinely revealed, and what does that mean to you?
I guess it means to me that someone has a clear enough view of reality that they are able to articulate it, as well as the process for knowing it, which comes from it ultimately.
Right. Divinely revealed, rooted in the highest truth, which can only be the highest truth saying I to different audiences. But they partake, the religions take on a form, and each one limits in different ways, but that doesn't mean that its source is limited, only its destination.
Well, it sort of loads the questions to talk about being religions, because there are undoubtedly revelations of the true that don't lead to being instantiated in historical religious traditions.
Oh, sure. So, I mean, there's nothing necessarily inherent in a revelation that requires or demands it be shared, unless that's part of the message that's received. But if the message that's received in the experience or the vision or whatever doesn't include that, maybe it's just supposed to be beneficial to the one who receives it. or it's too individualized to be shared with many people and doesn't get a large following. I used to really wince at the use of the word revealed when it wasn't in the perennialist writings or something like that, but I've gotten over it because every instant is revelation.
Indeed.
You could even say religions have to be divinely revealed because everything is.
How are we doing, Theta?
That's good.
Would you like to chime in on that one?
No, I actually think that those were great responses. The third question, there is a hadith that basically says that whatever causes a problem also contains its solution. Think of the hadith that says, if the fly flies into the water, dunk it in further, because if the one wing contains poison, the other one contains its solution. And since many of our modern ills have sprung from Christian civilization, should we be looking to Christianity for the solutions to modern problems?
What you mean, Christianity?
What would give you the impression that Christianity is able to deal with modern problems?
Well,
because they did such a good job in the Middle Ages dealing with those problems?
I didn't say that Christianity can solve the problems, but right now, from my viewpoint, the only authors that seem to actually be approaching this in the right way, really, the vast majority of them tend to be some form of Christian. And I think that there's a very pragmatic reason to that, and that's that where the problem starts, the problem tends to be most advanced, and then you tend to see it most clearly at that point. And there was the evolution of the problem. So it tended to grow here in a way where people were able to see, oh, here's the problem, let's talk about it, let's write about it. Whereas in certain places, it's just all at once been foisted upon those cultures, societies, civilizations. So from what I can see, some of the problems with the modern world are not being dealt with much at all. The only people that are dealing with that in a really intellectually rigorous and worthwhile manner tend to be coming at it from the Christian perspective.
Well, that's to be expected in a Christian civilization, I think. If you're concerned about the origin of the problems, then you look at the foundation of your civilization, and you may find, which is what I believe, that the problems come from giving the emphasis to one side of a duality or of a complementary pair, and that the solution is to reestablish the balance, which would be to go back and look into the religion to find the other pole and bring it out as a remedy. I mean, all this judgmentalism and everything in so many formal religions, I mean, it just overlooks the divine love, the divine goodness, the divine, all those things. It's like only looking at the wrathful names of God. And that doesn't work. You need rigor for some things and you need mercy for others.
Yes.
But I think that that is an example of the pure being found in the same thing from which the ill arises. So for a Christian-based civilization, that would be the most likely place to find that solution, would be in Christianity. And I'm sure the same with Islam. The abuses in there come from overemphasizing one thing over another, when things need to remain a pair, like yin and yang.
Shall we do one more?
All right. What purpose did God place us in this world for?
To know Him.
Yes. I guess you could also say, in order to behold the unfolding of the purpose of our lives.
That was in order to behold purpose of the unfolding?
Yes. Nobody knows in a precise way what we're here for, but obviously we're here to do what we do, is experience reality. And if we ask the right questions along the way, we may find something more eternal. But, you know, every day I can get up and find out what God's will is for me because it's what I do, or I find myself doing.
Yes, that's right. Get up in the morning and see what God has in mind for you today.
Right. So the purpose may proceed in time and never be completely expressed.
Well, and I would think that question is never satisfied at this level.
Well, true.
I believe the only reason we exist is so that God can know himself.
Right.
Theta Badria.
Well, I don't know why we exist other than, it's, I think, one of those questions that we can't really answer. I think that the answer that you've given, that we exist so that God can know itself, is probably the best answer that I've heard. But it's one of those questions like what existed before the creation of the universe, or what existed before God, or if nothing can be created nor destroyed, how did God come into being? It's one of those questions that is too deep for the human brain to fathom.
And certainly
So,
too deep for the language to express.
yes.
Well, I have something of a doctrinal digression on this, which has to do with God being infinite.
Yeah.
And if God is truly infinite, then one of the possibilities necessarily is for him to know himself in objective mode rather than just subjective mode. And that requires the arising of objects. And that's what we are, and that's what we're doing here.
Right. When did God come into being? No, it didn't happen that way. Being came out of God.
Say that again.
I said God never came into being. Being came from God.
Yes, that's a very good formulation, and it deals with certainly with the problem of language. I like that. Here.